The raspberry stitch is a repeated pattern of 4. If you're using this pattern for a scarf, as I am in this demonstration, you'll repeat that pattern 6 times to fill our 24 middle pegs. If you're using this pattern for the blanket or Afghan, you're going to repeat that pattern 48 times. This pattern is a little tricky to master. However, I've found some tips that can help. Our first step is to prepare our sequence of 4 pegs. We're going to take the yarn from these 3 pegs and move them all over 1 peg to the right. So 3 moves on to peg 4, 2 moves on to peg 3, and 1 moves on to peg 2. Then we'll take this peg 3 and move it over 1 more time. These 4 are prepared. I'll show you that again. 3 moves to 4, 2 moves to 3, 1 moves to 2, and then we move 3 over to 4. So what you'll end up with after preparing these groups of 4 are empty, 1, empty, 3 loops, empty, 1, empty, 3 loops, and so on. When you see this repeated pattern across your entire loom, empty, 1, empty, 3, empty, 1, empty, 3, etc., you know you've prepared it correctly. The next step is tricky. It might take you a few tries to get the hang of it, but stick with it. To start the raspberry stitch after preparing our pegs, we're going to move the yarn behind this empty peg, and we're going to begin a purl, pulling the yarn up and through. However, instead of pulling it off this peg and placing it there, we're actually going to place it on the empty peg in the direction we're coming from. After you've placed the purl loop on the peg that preceded this peg, you're going to reach under, pull a loop down, and bring that the direction you're coming from. Then you'll reach from above and pull a loop up and bring it the direction you're going. Pull this off of the peg. Put the first loop on your left on the peg you've been working. Pull the other loop to tighten that yarn. Bring your working yarn behind the empty peg, place the loop over it, and pull to tighten. Bring your working yarn in front of the next peg, peg 4, and pull these 3 loops over it. Let's watch that again. Start with a purl, but put it on the empty peg you just passed. Reach under, pull a loop down, and in the direction you're coming from, reach from above, and pull a loop up in the direction you're going. Bring it off the peg. Your first loop goes on the peg you've been working. The yarn goes behind the next peg, and the loop goes over it. Bring your working yarn in front of the next peg, and bring those 3 loops over. You can do them one at a time. You can do them all 3 at a time. Use the technique that works for you. Let's watch that again. Go behind the empty peg, reach down, purl up, put it on the empty peg. Go from the underside, loop down and pull it the direction you've been coming from. Reach from above, pull a loop up, bring it the direction you're going. Pull it off the peg, put the first loop on the peg you've been working, bring the working yarn behind, put the second loop on the empty peg. Working yarn goes in front and above your 3 loops, and you knit them over. 1, 2, 3. Let's watch it again. Don't get discouraged if it takes a few tries to get the hang of this. It does get easier the more you practice it. The best advice I can give you, aside from practice, is don't be afraid to make these loops a little on the long side while you're getting the hang of it. Giving yourself that extra room to learn will help you not to get loops that are a little bit stiff when you try to pull them. We'll end our first raspberry stitch row in the same way we've ended all the rest, with an E wrap that goes behind and around, a U wrap that goes behind and around the front, and then another E wrap that goes behind and around. We're going to do the same stitch in the same order, but this time going from right to left. Our pattern of 4 starts here. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we're going to move 3 to 4, 2 to 3, 1 to 2, and then we'll move 3 to 4 again. So once again we have empty, 1, empty, 3. 3 moves to 4, 2 moves to 3, 1 moves to 2, and then we move 3 over one more time so that we have empty, 1, empty, 3 for our pegs 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now that we've prepared our second raspberry stitch row, this time going from right to left, we're going to knit it the same way we knit the previous row. Purl and place on the peg we passed. Go from the underside to bring a loop in the direction you're coming from. Come from above to bring up a loop that you'll pull the direction you're going. Place the first loop on the peg you've been working, bring the working yarn behind, place the second loop on the empty peg, pull it tight but not too tight, and then we'll bring this yarn in front of the peg that has the 3 loops and we'll knit them over. We're coming to the end of our right to left raspberry stitch. E-wrap the second to last peg as always. U-wrap on the end. E-wrap, U-wrap, E-wrap, and you've made it through the most difficult part of this project. You're probably ready for an easier row at this point, and I've got great news for you. After our left to right raspberry stitch and our right to left raspberry stitch, we get 2 rows of pearls. Sounds like something you'd wear to a fancy dinner party. Starting on that third peg, purl your way from left to right until you get to those last 2 pegs. I've almost finished my first row of pearls. E-wrap, U-wrap, E-wrap, and then purl your way from right to left. When you finish your right to left row of pearls and you've done your 2 end pegs coming back left to right again, you're ready to do 2 more rows of the raspberry stitch. So once again, you want to start by preparing your loom in groups of 4. Move the 3 pegs over so that 1 is empty, 2 will have a single stitch on it, 3 will be empty, and 4 will have 3 stitches. Continue that for the rest of the row until we get to our 2 end pegs. I'm preparing my final set of 4. And now I'm ready for my left to right raspberry stitch. Remember to come behind the empty peg, purl, place on the empty peg, pull a loop down, bring it the direction you're coming from, pull a loop up, bring it the direction you're going. Place your first loop on the peg you've been working. Working yarn goes behind. Place your second loop on the empty peg. Don't pull too tightly because we need to work these pegs on the way back with the reverse raspberry stitch. Finally, we knit our 3 loops over. Continue this for the rest of the row. E-wrap, U-wrap, E-wrap, and we're ready to prepare our right to left raspberry row. So now our pegs are 1, 2, 3, and 4. After you've prepared your right to left raspberry stitch rows, they should look like empty, 1 loop, empty, 3, and so on. You're ready to knit. Go behind the empty peg, purl, place on the empty peg, bring a loop down, bring it the direction you're coming from, bring a loop up, pull it the direction you're going. Put the first loop on the peg you've been working. With the working yarn behind, your second loop goes on the empty peg. That was a close one. And then we'll knit over. Continue that pattern from right to left. As always, the E-wrap comes next. The U-wrap on the end. Another E-wrap. And we finish up our raspberry portion of this pattern by doing one row of left to right purl stitches all the way until we get to those last 2 pegs in the row. I'm finishing my row of purls. Using my E-wrap and my U-wrap and my E-wrap. I'm ready for the very last row in our pattern. We finish our pattern with a row of E-wraps. I'm going to bring my project down so that I have plenty of room to wrap all the way across the entire panel, because I like to live dangerously. When you get to the end of this E-wrap row, going to U-wrap, lock it in, knit over the rest of the pegs, go back to the beginning of your row, prepare peg 2 with that same E-wrap that we use in every row, and you're ready to go back to the beginning again with row 1, starting with 4 pegs knit over and 2 purl pegs. I've reached the desired length for my project, so now I'm ready to finish it. You'll notice that along the way we've created panels of the raspberry stitch alternating with panels of the basket weave stitch. You can end your project at the edge of any of these panels, but I've decided to end mine at the edge of one of the basket sections because that will give it some nice symmetry for where we started. I'm on my very last row of the basket weave stitch. Remember, this row is identical to the second row in our pattern. So we have our 2 end pegs, our 4 knit over pegs, and our 2 purl pegs. I'm going to purl the last 2, knit over 4, then as always, E-wrap peg 2, and U-wrap the end peg. Before I bind off, I'm going to do one final row of E-wrap. Finishing this row, securing the last peg, knitting over, and we're ready for the basic bind off. I'm going to start by E-wrapping my second peg, knitting over, then I'll move this loop over to peg 1, knit over this one, and then move peg 1 yarn to peg 2. I'll do that again. Now that this is peg 2, I E-wrap it, knit over, move peg 2 to peg 1, knit over, move peg 1 to peg 2, and I'm ready to continue. E-wrap, knit over, move 1 peg to the right, knit over, move 1 peg to the left. Continue this process until you get to the end of the row. When we get to this final peg, we will knit over, wrap it again, knit over, and we'll pull this through because this is the yarn that we will cut in order to finish the project. I started with 268 yards or 245 meters, and I have that much left over. At the end, you can take a yarn needle, thread the tail through it, and weave that tail into the project. This tucks it away nicely. Thanks so much for joining me for this tutorial video today. I hope you enjoy this pattern as much as I do.